You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. The challenge of staying timely with a weekly program like this came to the fore last week when we had already wrapped the program and it was already in the post-production phase just when the major story broke that Jill Abramson, first woman executive editor of the New York Times, had been summarily fired after 17 years at the paper and 2.5 at the top of the masthead job, reportedly for insisting on equal pay and for having a management style that was not, well, warm and fuzzy. The same day, Nathalie Nougaraid, editor-in-chief of the French classic paper Le Monde, was also sacked, reportedly for the same reasons. Journalists went into shock. Women journalists went into rage. The Twitterverse went crazy. But this program was already too far into post-production, and time was too short for a do-over. Consequently, we're making up for it this week with a vengeance. The entire program will be on this subject, the glass cliff, or what happens to women when we do get a toehold on power and actually exercise authority. And we have a distinguished panel of journalists to delve deep into this and related issues. Soraya Chemaly, Carol Jenkins, Geneva Overholser, and Gloria Steinem will join me in this discussion. More about them in a moment. But first, we need to look inside these very headlines. The history and culture of the New York Times has been undeniably misogynistic, just as it's undeniable that Jill Abramson had set her sights on changing that. Let's look at that history. Susan Tift and Alex Jones wrote a fine book called The Trust, which is a history of the Oakes-Sulzberger family, the dynasty that has controlled and owns the New York Times. Adolph Oakes bought it in 1896. It's OCHS. He barred women from the newsroom, which was the practice of the day, although the Times continued that practice after other newspapers had stopped. Oakes' only child was a girl. Iphigenia, a girl, born in 1892. She secretly joined the Times when she was about to graduate from Barnard in 1914, and her father found out and had her fired. That was the first time a woman was fired from the New York Times. So she married Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, and a precedent was established, which was that not the daughter but the son-in-law inherited. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger became publisher in 1935 after Oakes, the father-in-law, died. And Iphigenia, the daughter, was not always very happy about this arrangement. She made that clear in 1955 when, to celebrate Sulzberger's 20th year as publisher, an all-male stag party was held at the 21 Club in New York. Women, including the rightful heir, his wife, Iphigenia, were not allowed. What is this, Saudi Arabia? So she sent a recorded toast instead. It said, "Dear Arthur, once more you must admit I am right. If this were not a man's world, as I've always insisted it was, I would not be left out in the cold tonight. If I'd been the boss's son instead of his daughter, this party might have been for me and not for you." I'm sure everyone chuckled at what a good sport and what a wit Iphigenia was to send the tape, totally missing the real bitterness in the message. Only 4 women were hired in the newsroom while Oakes held the reins, and that was late in his time as publisher. But in 1921, Ann O'Hare McCormick pushed her way in, convincing the then managing editor that she should send him articles from Europe, only being paid by column length. And he said, "Well, you can try," thinking it would come to nothing. And she managed exclusive interviews with Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler and Roosevelt, all at column-length rates. She was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize at the New York Times. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger finally stepped aside as publisher in favor of, guess who? You got it, his son-in-law, Orville Dreyfus, the husband of his daughter Marion. But Dreyfus died soon after, and the only son among the 4 Sulzberger children was considered a bit young to inherit. That was Arthur Oakes Sulzberger, nicknamed Punch. But, of course, staring them in the face and being ignored was Ruth Sulzberger, their daughter, who by then was married and co-running a paper with her husband, the Chattanooga Times. She knew the family business, she'd sat on the board, but she was passed up, and Punch eventually became publisher and chair of the board. And when he retired in 92, the post went to Arthur Oakes Sulzberger Jr., his son. Which brings us to the 1970s. Nearly 600 women were employed at the New York Times at that point, and they formed a caucus and sued under equal employment guidelines, and most of them had been employed in the classified ads section. But after 4 years, the federal court approved a settlement. However, the part of the settlement that set goals and timetables for appointing women to upper-level positions kind of was assiduously ignored. The Times, by the way, was the last newspaper to use the honorific Ms., MS, period. And now we have Arthur Sulzberger Jr. Firing Jill Abramson. And over the weekend last, he came out rather nastily on her management style because, of course, he couldn't fault her journalism or other facts that, for example, the young staffers, especially but not exclusively women, adored her, that 8 Pulitzer Prizes had been won in her 2.5 years as executive editor, or that she'd brought the paper to financial solidity, or that she had overseen the successful expanse into digital, all under her aegis and on her watch. Or the issue of pension pay and parity pay, which of course the Times denies, and she had hired a lawyer to investigate. All only a matter of style, her style. The New York Times has as its motto, all the news that's fit to print. Of course, who decides what's fit to print? Who decides? I'm wondering whether it's perhaps time that we question whether all the Sulzbergers are fit to publish. And now it's time for our roundtable. The panelists are Soraya Chemaly, who is a feminist writer, media critic, and activist, and a regular contributor to Salon, The Huffington Post, The Feminist Wire, and lots of other online media, including CNN. Her writing also appears in The Guardian and Ms. Magazine. She's a frequent radio and online commentator with Al Jazeera and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the BBC. She is a member of the Women's Media Center Board of Directors. Carol Jenkins is an award-winning writer, producer, and media consultant. A recipient of both the Lifetime Achievement and International Reporting Awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, her reporting career covered her anchoring WNBC TV's evening newscast, as well as covering presidential and mayoral politics, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison in South Africa, and she also hosted on WNYW her own daily talk show, Carol Jenkins Live. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and was the founding president and board member of the Women's Media Center. Geneva Overholser is the former director of the University of Southern California Annenberg School of Journalism. Previously, she held the Curtis Hurley Chair in Public Affairs Reporting for the Missouri School of Journalism. She was editor of the Des Moines Register from 1988 to 1995, where she led the paper to a Pulitzer Prize. She's been ombudsman, or ombudswoman, of the Washington Post, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post Writers Group, and a columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review. Through the Annenberg Public Policy Center, she published a manifesto on the future of journalism titled, On Behalf of Journalism, A Manifesto for Change. She was for 9 years a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board, the final year as chair, and she's a former officer of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and she now sits on the board of directors of the Women's Media Center. Gloria Steinem is a writer, lecturer, editor, and feminist activist who in 1972 co-founded Ms. Magazine and remained one of its editors for 15 years. As a freelance writer, she's been published in Esquire, the New York Times Magazine, and many women's magazines. Her books include the bestsellers Revolution from Within, Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, and Moving Beyond Words. She also co-founded the Women's Media Center together with her sister co-founders, Jane Fonda and myself, in 2004. She's received the Penny Missouri Journalism Award, the Front Page and Clarion Awards, National Magazine Awards, the Lifetime Achievement in Journalism Award from the Society of Professional Journalists, and recently the University of Missouri School of Journalism Award for Distinguished Service in Journalism. So, distinguished roundtable, Carol, Geneva, Soraya, and Gloria, thank you for being with us today. It seems that we're back to approach and style and brusqueness, difficult to talk to, women should be listeners, authoritarian, all of which was said not only about Jill Abramson, but about Nathalie Nougarid at Le Monde. And both women happen to be presiding over the newsroom at a moment when digitalization was coming in, not to the happiness of most members of the newsroom. So they had difficult turf, but they got blamed. What, given the nature of this story, which is changing, what so far, as of now, is your take on this? I just would like to go round and start with Geneva.
Well, thank you, Robin. This is Geneva. I think what is so dispiriting is that once again we're focusing on style, and every time specifics have been listed as to what was wrong with Jill's management style, we hear things that simply don't stack up to a firing offense. We hear things that we all know male editors have done to much greater degree, being polarizing or embarrassing people publicly, or demanding that people go back and, find a photo, or asking why stories didn't appear in the Times. These are things that either editors ought to do or editors of old did much more brusquely. So I think that that's a great deal of the pain of this. It's very hard to equate that with any of that being a firing offense, and certainly with deserving the kind of indignity of this dismissal.
Yeah, she brought the paper 8 Pulitzers during her period and oversaw very successful digitalization, so that's not chopped liver. Who else wants to leap in here next? Soraya?
Yes, thank you, Robin. I agree with Geneva. I think what causes so much concern, and I think a really visceral response if you're a woman and you've been in these environments, is the idea that is kind of implied in all of this, which is that we all have to play nice. We just have to be nice people. And somehow that will ensure that we can accomplish our goals, or that we'll be more successful in these spaces. And what's really lacking in all of these conversations, and there's been so many really excellent analyses and thoughtful reflections on what's happened, what's missing to me, both in a lot of the public conversation and also in a lot of the ways that organizations are trying to address these problems, is a real commitment to understanding implicit biases and stereotype threats as a way to constructively challenge incidences like these. I just don't see enough emphasis being placed in those areas, and so it's difficult because it's really easy to second guess and to not be able to point a finger at explicit sexism. Although we all have the feeling that clearly there was sexism at play, it's just hard to say how and what it was and why it worked or didn't work.
Yeah, it's the sort of silencing effect, because if she and the Le Monde editor were difficult to talk to, what is what is the implication? I keep thinking, are you supposed to be a better listener, as women are supposed to be? I don't know. Carol, what's your take?
Well, I was amused and equally amazed to read Kathleen Parker's columnist. Usually conservative writer who sort of indicated that Jill Abramson was the tipping point and would probably change the election, in 2016 because it was just too much. I think in a week where Hillary was accused of having brain damage. Yes. And Jill, of being a lousy manager, publicly humiliated in a crazy way, I would say, almost, a self-destructive way for the New York Times. And I don't know why there isn't better advice going on there. But I think that in a way this whole thing is done us a favor in that, in that it's really just too much. And I think that even women who would shy away from this sort of, our feminist, we're not being treated equally, it's not fair, well, see that this just, does not hold water. So I, think that, that this will be a pivotal moment in journalism where, and the rest of society and business where women will just put an end to this, and that's what we really have to find. How do you stop it? And I think that this will do that. Interesting comment in the Le Monde story where someone who was quoted said, "Well, what's going on is that we're really having a crisis in social habits," and I really, I think that we only now are getting to the point where women are actually getting into these positions, and so people see what it is. And are now having to learn how to change their habits. And that's a hard thing, as we all know. Any of us try to change our habits. That's difficult to do.
That's so interesting. I had a similar thought when I heard that people were considering demonstrating and they were writing to the Times and they were considering canceling their subscriptions. I haven't seen, I think, this kind of just organic groundswell, not at all organized, not at all, quote, women's movement, but from real, just ordinary women out there. I haven't seen this since the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, I think. So maybe you're right, Carol, which would be a positive outcome at least. Gloria, what about you?
Well, it's obvious that it is a double standard, a huge, huge double standard. We have all known editors of newspapers, and especially the New York Times. I'm thinking of Abe Rosenthal, who was so difficult that, was legendary. So there is clearly a double standard. I think what the New York Times doesn't realize is that there is also a different kind of double standard in the sense that people expect better behavior from them. So they are going to engender much, much, much more anger and outrage and disappointment than, say, a network or some other journalistic body might. Mm-hmm. And they're going to have to deal with this. Also, I think backstage, the New York Times has always been extraordinarily hypersensitive. When women as a group sued the New York Times for sex discrimination in the 70s, the Sulzberger of the era tried to get their lawyer fired from Columbia Law School for being their lawyer. Wow. And so we can't underestimate the degree to which this noblesse oblige. It's not a problem of a woman who's being too critical. It's a problem of a newspaper that is absolutely incapable of taking criticism. All right. So this is a very it's both a typical case and a special case. Also special in the sense that wherever power is greater, the discrimination against outgroups is the greatest.
We have to pause for a moment, and when we come back, I want to go into the deep water and tackle the repeating agony in which a man of color and a white woman are pitted against each other, competing, while women of color don't even get to approach the starting gate, and while white men, I swear, somewhere sit back and chuckle. So we'll be back to talk about that. You're listening to Women's Media Center Live, and I'm Robin Morgan, and we will be right back with our panel on what happens when women actually exercise even a little power.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
Welcome back, and welcome back to our panel, Soraya Chemaly, Carol Jenkins, Geneva Overholser, and Gloria Steinem. All right, Carol, you want to start?
Okay, I posted one of my most ridiculous Facebook posts ever, because when the news of Jean, ascending to this position came across, I was so excited. The first African American, fantastic. And then I put ... waiting to hear more about Jill, which of course, I don't know what I was thinking in the back of my mind. I was saying, maybe Facebook is going to give her $100 million in shares, to start a news operation there. But something wonderful was happening for her, and not that it would be this really ugly firing. So, but as the story has unfolded, I really don't think it's a black man, white woman. I mean, to me, clearly, this is a white woman and a white man in a management dispute. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is poor Dean. First of all, his ascendancy is somewhat tainted by this whole thing, and he, the reports of him slamming his, hand into a wall get, blown out of proportion or put in proportion. Who knows? But at any rate, it does him no favors. But I really think that this is a question of bad management, but more to the point, the New York Times bad management. Sulzberger, who clearly does not have his operation under control, and has really made a mess of things there.
Anybody else have any other thoughts on that?
Well, I'm sorry. This is Geneva. I thought I would just weigh in for a moment by saying that it does occur to me that the institutions that are progressive or enlightened enough to bring women and people of color to the top may be so few that women and people of color end up being pitted against one another more often than would otherwise be the case. But I think what this shows is the extraordinary pain caused by giving someone an opportunity and then not supporting her. As I've written, I think the editor-publisher relationship is absolutely key. I also think the editor-managing editor relationship is key. And the signs in this case seem to indicate that neither one of those relationships worked very well. And I just think you cannot run a newspaper unless those teams work. And as somebody else has said, it looked like a dream team, a woman and a black guy leading the newsroom. But sure, as they also said, it was a dream, but never a team. I mean, it didn't work, and particularly between the publisher and editor.
Robin, this is Gloria. I think one of the questions we ought to ask right away is, what salary is he getting? Is he getting an equal salary? In an ideal world, of course, if this were a straight-up competition situation, they would stand together, and that does occasionally happen. I mean, Derek Bell quit Harvard Law School because there was no black woman on the law faculty. Sometimes it is clear that this is a coalition, and mostly we are, as Robin points out, pitted against each other. But it is it is what it is now, and I think it's very important that we both point out the unfairness to her and demand fairness for him on salary and everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is Soraya. I think I felt more on the side that Robin described, which is the appearance of the black man, white woman being pitted against each other, because this pattern is not new, and it's not unique to the New York Times. I mean, there was a report that came out just a few weeks ago about how even the most liberal of our media outlets are dominated by white men. And there's just the prevailing feeling that, okay, the status quo is in place, it remains in place, and that the same people are going to make the same kinds of decisions. And there's a place, and there's only one place, and either a white woman or a black man is going to fill it, which may not be accurate, but it looks that way. It gives the appearance of that kind of mechanism working with very little internal resistance to change.
Yeah.
Well, especially because, this is Gloria, especially because the New York Times should have been inherited by Ruth Holmberg as the sister of the Sulzberger. The New York Times itself has been inherited in a very, very patriarchal way and has dismissed talent within its own family.
And then ownership continues in that vein. The people in the next generation who come from the family are almost all men who are involved in the paper. It's really...
Yes, it continues, and it needn't, because, I mean, in my opinion, knowing Ruth Holmberg, who then became farmed out as the publisher of the Chattanooga Times, it would have been a much better newspaper. She was a much smarter, more humane person than her brother. So, it is itself passed down through the family in a profoundly patriarchal way. I have been for years saying it was like hemophilia. It passes through men, through women, and men get it. The New York Times.
Clearly it's not only New York Times. It is the optic, and I also long for that magic moment. The Derek Bells of the world are few and far between. But whereas actually the story that's coming out is that he said to Sulzberger, either she goes or I do, because he was so hurt by that time. So it's hideous management. It's not good,
Well, and also wasn't he? This is Gloria. I believe he was passed over.
Yes,
he felt passed over.
Yes,
in hiring her.
That's right. Even though they.
But to the New York Times' credit, they had a woman and a man of color in those positions, where no one could dispute the fact that each of them were qualified,
right,
to do the job. So that's on the positive side.
Right.
So I really, and this is Carol, want to make sure that the emphasis is kept on the white male, the patriarchy, as responsible for this mishandling, as opposed to blaming the black guy or blaming the woman, which is again pitting them against each other. This really is the Sulzberger mishandling of his operation, I believe, and so it has to go back to, if she had a coach, he should have had a coach,
right,
in terms of management.
Right. All right, we're going to have to take a little break again, and then we'll come back and talk about the glass cliff. Just a short break here at Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan, and we will return in just a moment with our panel. Don't go away.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
And we're back again with Gloria Steinem, Geneva Overholser, Carol Jenkins, and Soraya Chemaly. So now we have a new phrase, oh goody, the glass cliff. It turns out, as we pan back to the larger field of this, that women CEOs are forced out of their jobs 11 times more frequently than males are. So, as you all know, because you all sit on the Women's Media Center board, the Women's Media Center report on the status of women in media 2014, the annual report that just came out this year, does not have happy news in it. Men dominate media, all outlets and all topics. And when you go to the section on women in leadership, it's deplorable. I mean, women comprised 15.3% of the boards of directors of the top 10 national news organizations. One female Gracia Martori of Gannett was a CEO at one of those top 10 firms. Leadership ranks in the magazine industry were 43.2% female. In television news, 21.6% female. In newspapers, 19.2% female, and so forth and so on. 4 females, or 16%, were editors-in-chief at the nation's 25 largest newspapers. It's now 3. So what do we do with that?
Well, this is Gloria. I think there's one title we need. It's called owner.
I like it.
Because the truth is, as long as, in a way, women are like an immigrant group, and the Irish, the Italians, African, everybody has had a tough time working their way up in varying degrees through the dominant system, and therefore each new group ends up with a larger share of starting their own business than, more women are trying to start their own businesses than men. Of course, they're much smaller. I'm not comparing in size. But I do think that it's both a reason and an encouragement to go outside a structure, to go someplace where nobody can fire you, and start your own enterprise.
Well, this is Geneva. I would say it's now more important than ever, as Gloria points out, that women own the place, because there is no more vulnerable situation than the one that Jill was in my view, and the one that Dean is now in. I mean, newsrooms are impossible to run. They've always been hard to run, but back in the day when I was editor, a long time ago, you didn't have the additional challenge of trying to lead change. And while the Times has changed, it hasn't changed nearly quickly enough. This is a very different world, in a digital world, in a world where business innovation is essential, and you got to try to lead journalism through those dangerous shoals. So what we have here is a person who comes into leadership and is palpably different, that is a woman, and is trying to lead change, which nobody likes, in a room that is always fertile with anonymous grapes. So here is, a perfect situation for vulnerability, and boy, was she ever.
And Geneva, isn't it the case that also she was trying to create revenue streams from readers so that she wouldn't be so enslaved to advertisers? And that is the principal journalistic position, but it put her in contradiction to the talent coming in, or a particular executive coming in who was in charge.
Both the technological and economic changes were, made her even more vulnerable.
Yeah,
right.
Really tough.
But this is Carol. Wasn't it said over and over again by the Times that her work was not at issue?
Yes,
absolutely.
So
but when this is Gloria, her journalistic work was not at issue, but they included, it seemed to me, in the management question, some criticism, even though she had increased the income of the Times more than anybody could reasonably expect, that she was resistant to economic advances that made them dependent on other than readers.
Yeah, I should have been clearer. I don't think I wasn't applying any criticism of her work. I was saying that if you're going to have to win popularity in the newsroom, this is the worst possible time to try to do it.
Yeah. And at Le Monde, it was same, because the staff at Le Monde rose up in revolt. They had, in fact, pushed for hiring her, Nougat Reid, but they rose up against because they didn't want to deal with digital. So, I mean, Geneva, you said an interesting thing in a conversation we had a day or so ago about sort of they let women in when the property is already devalued, when the industry is in spasm, and then they blame us if something goes wrong?
Right. Well, I think, we sort of saw that with Katie Couric. She finally got to be an anchor, and it was when anchors were widely being seen as not as important. I do feel that in some ways women now, and in the case of Dean, a person of color, are enabled to have this remarkable position, but it's a more difficult time than ever to have it.
Yeah.
Well, this is Gloria. I think that's absolutely true, and it's true, say, of mayors of cities. Just when the city is in financial trouble, the tax base is fled, then a woman gets to be mayor. So, the less competition for the job, the more out groups are able to get into it, but there has been less competition for a reason. I also think in the very long term, if I can say a kind of almost anthropological thing, that as long as most of us are raised by women, and men especially, who don't even have their own example to the contrary, will continue to associate female authority with childhood and will continue to feel unmanned by an authoritative woman, because the last time they saw a woman in power, they were 8 or 10, and they literally feel regressed. Yeah. And if you think about the response to Hillary Clinton's candidacy and the big grown-up news people on television who were saying things like, I cross my legs whenever I see her, and she reminds me of my first wife outside alimony. I mean, just horrendous things. And these were intelligent men. It is in a deep way, I think they're feeling regressed. So until men are raising children too, and until we have enough women in authority and men raising children, we're going to continue to have a certain amount of resistance among men, especially, to women in power.
What?
This is Soraya. I agree with you. I think what's interesting in this dynamic, particularly in newsrooms, is how deeply embedded the linguistic norms are in terms of gender, because we simply expect girls as children to speak less, to not interrupt, to be more polite, to not use obscene language, and when they transgress, they're punished for it, and yet somehow they're supposed to adapt to those norms in the public sphere, and then we're supposed to ignore the fact that they're penalized for doing just that. So it really is an untenable position as long as we have these extremely, extremely gendered ideas about speech and behavior, and even as subtle as things like body language, and we kind of ignore that and pretend there are equivalencies very often, certainly in mainstream media conversations about events like this.
All right.
Carol, I just wanted to say that one of the things that I loved about Jill's commencement address at Wake Forest was her common sense and her humor and her ability to handle disaster, if you will, without freaking out, which is also the way women are often described. We can't take it and we'll,
yes,
shut ourselves in our houses and we'll, strike out. She did none of that, and I think that alone is, if we're going to talk about this cliff that people are being pushed off of, we need more examples of women who can really handle it. Not that we need more women pushed off the cliff, but I think that hers is an example of, disaster happens to everyone, and you just, move along. And, when someone asked her if she was going to have that tattoo, the famous times the tattoo taken off her back, and she said, not a chance. That was the honor of my life. I love the newspaper. But do I know what's happening for me next? No, but let's just move forward. And I think that was really instructive and should be instructive to women to be able to take it on the chin and move along.
That's a great point.
No,
Gloria,
Gloria,
let me interrupt you. Hold your thought till we come back from a break. Our last break here at Women's Media Center Live, where I am still, through rain and storm and gloom of night, Robin Morgan. We'll be back for one more round with this fantastic panel in just a moment.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
And welcome back one more time to our panel. Geneva Overholser, Carol Jenkins, Gloria Steinem, and Soraya Chemaly. Okay, Gloria, you were about to say something.
I just wanted to say how much I agree with Carol and how important it is not only personally and in the deep sense, but also tactically to remember that for the most part, people will accept the event in the way that you do.
Mm.
So you have to consider that, and that in itself is gendered because it's easier to present ourselves as a victim than a victor.
Yeah, although
we ourselves need to take the power, the personal power, to not present ourselves as a victim,
right,
and
right.
to just keep going, keep our sense of humor, keep our strengths, and more people will accept it in the way we do.
Well, I think
I also love that she used the stick with your knitting, very feminine, very female.
I think that was her dig. Yeah, I think that was her final sort of dig. I do think that it's. I mean, she's been called a victim no matter what she does, but and I think that she is a victim of mismanagement and sexism at the times. But it's one thing to be that, and another thing to act victimized. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being.
And not only that. It's another thing. I don't mean we should say I forgive them for they know not what they do, but I think that we should pity these idiots who are not administrators, who are so biased they can't adjust to the talent of half the human race, and we should have that attitude toward them.
Yes, I know, but sometimes it's hard because sometimes one wants to do violent things even though one is a pacifist. Isn't one? So what do we learn, sisters? Cheryl has her lean in approach. Well, God knows, as a number of people have pointed out, that Jill leaned in. Anne Friedman in New York Magazine wrote, "It's hard to know what's sexism and what's yourself." People are wondering, will younger women push harder now, or will they backpedal? Is the message been sent to them? Certainly Susan Glasser, writing in Politico, said in editing while females, said that women are still outliers in media, and there'll be fewer of them going this route because they don't intend to be treated this way. I think there's good news in that there are excellent young women writers who have been writing brilliantly about this. Rebecca Traister in New Republic, you, Soraya, in the Ms. blog, Amanda Hess in Slate, just a whole lot of commentary that if anybody thinks feminism is not alive, kicking, and red-hot furious and intelligent, really good journalists online and off. But what have we learned, and how can we use it to change this so it doesn't happen quite this way again?
This is Carol. I'll go back to the theory that this was, in fact, the tipping point, because the line of, civilization was crossed, or seemed to be. And the New York Times is really the one taking a drubbing over all of this. So, usually everybody would say, oh, the New York Times, they can do no wrong. But in this case, everybody is inflamed. And even those who would like to say, well, maybe they had reason, say, but they handled it very badly. And so, I think that it should inspire women to know that there are people on our side.
Mm-hmm.
This is Geneva. I think it is. I agree absolutely with what Carol said so beautifully, and I also think that it's so striking that this happened at the New York Times and at Le Monde at the very same time to women who, in each instance, were said to be too brusque and difficult managers, and both of whom were called excellent leaders and terrific journalists. And I also think that the number of women, absolutely, as you've said, just writing very powerful things, and the number of women in the Times newsroom saying how much Jill meant to them, the praise she's getting for, so often when women encounter something like this, you either don't see that they themselves had acted as much as one would hope on behalf of women, which Jill clearly did, and you don't see this outpouring of support. So I feel hopeful about it. I mean, if something like this is going to happen, at least we may find power as a result of it.
That's true. Those are real changes that both of you raise. What about you, Soraya, and you, Gloria?
Soraya, you go first.
Well, I don't know. My husband says that in order to do what we do, we have to be daily pessimists and lifelong optimists. So I'm going to try and stick with that idea in this scenario. I see a lot of young women, especially millennial women, who maybe have not gotten to the point in life where they are having children, which radically changes the equation, I think, for women, particularly in newsrooms, particularly looking at pay. I think they're really, really cautious about how to proceed. I am not an advocate of lean-in approaches, and I think that a lot of younger women are rethinking that approach when they look at this case, rightfully so. There was an article in the American Prospect this morning, and the headline was, "What a softer managerial style has saved Jill Abramson." And I think that those are the kinds of questions that millennial women are asking, which to me is really problematic for lots of reasons. I'm glad they're asking it, but I think that asking it that way is a problem. I really want to hold the institution accountable and not have it turned back on what can women do to adapt to norms in order to make other people happy.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think it's very, very important that we not start blaming the victim, that we look at it realistically, that we understand that if women are going to lean out in, men have to lean out if we're going to end up in the same place. And we need to do two things, I think, which is keep up the criticism big time, not only of who they hire and how they treat them, but how they inherit, how this newspaper is inherited and how they have, feverishly restructured themselves. Heaven forfend something happened like Sally Bingham and the Louisville Courier. They are obsessed with patriarchy. So both from an inheritance point of view and a hiring point of view, they're not up to anything like modern standards. And we need to support each other, because how we find out whether we are doing something that we could correct or are being treated unfairly is generally by the support and insight and honesty of the other women around us.
I heard a lovely thing, Gloria, this morning, which was that, one of Abramson's books was on Anita Hill and the Thomas hearings. And Anita sent her a note immediately upon hearing this about ways to survive it, and you'll be just fine. And this from a person whom in Congress was called a little bit slutty and a little bit nutty. This was the great Anita Hill, and you're right, Geneva and Carol. It's been there from the young women in this case more than one would have expected in the past, even though, as Soraya says, they may be a little leery of media, and that we've got to address. We've got to somehow make it a more hospitable place. Thank you, all of you, so much for doing this and being with us on Women's Media Center Live. This has been incredibly helpful and educative, and lots to think about and act on. So thank you.
Thank you,
Robin.
And now it's time for Fighting Words. Well, you have to admit that a life of activism is not boring. So this week, of course, there was the crisis of Jill Abramson's firing from the New York Times. And in passing, by the way, there was Karl Rove announcing that maybe Hillary had brain damage. The week before that, of course, was, and it still is ongoing, the tragedy of the Nigerian girls being kidnapped. And I want to say a word about that because many of you have written saying, what can we do? If you're approached by groups or get emailings from groups saying, send us money, we are going to rescue the girls, they are not legitimate. Nobody can rescue the girls unless possibly the Navy SEALs, and hopefully they're on the case. But we have found a legitimate group, if you want to give, that will help Nigerian women and girls. It is called WRAPA, W-R-A-P-A. That stands for Women's Rights Advancement and Protection Alternative, Women's Rights Advancement and Protection Alternative, WRAPA. Since 1999, this group has provided legal aid, counseling, and job training to women in Nigeria, and they continue to advocate on behalf of all of Nigeria's women, North and South, Muslim and Christian, to protect and advance women's rights in the country. They are an extremely fine group, and you can give to them and get a tax deduction via DonorDirectAction.org. This is a nonprofit group that was set up specifically so that Americans wishing to donate to groups abroad and support groups abroad could be networked with them and could have a tax deduction when they gave. I sit on the steering committee, and 90% of your donation goes to the group. Only 10% is reserved for bank fees and overhead, which is kept very low because our offices are virtual. They don't even exist in bricks and mortar. So that would be, if you wish to donate, DonorDirectAction.org, and once you're on the website, go and look for WRAPA, W-R-A-P-A. Last but most assuredly not least, news on Amnesty International's pending decision to oppose the Nordic model to fight prostitution. The Nordic model, you may remember, penalizes Johns for the first time, penalizes buyers, keeps pimps and brothel owners criminalized, but decriminalizes the women. This is a successfully proven success and backed by the international women's movement, by survivors all over the world, survivors of the sex industry, and by me, and by President Jimmy Carter, who was recently my first male guest on the program. Regulars will remember. You can check it out in episode 81. It was here that he learned of Amnesty's pending position and immediately offered, to my shock, to write an open letter to them telling them please not to do this. The letter was then followed up. He wrote it, it got sent, and it may have done the trick, certainly together with the amazing organizing by survivors and the women's movement. We keep learning that more and more countries, national Amnesty Internationals, have said, let's wait. Let's not rush to judgment on this. And we hear a very strong rumor that the board of the International Secretariat has resolved to hold off any decisions on quote-unquote sex work, that is, the prostitution industry and sexual exploitation industry, until the summer of 2015, after the conference at the Carter Center that he decided to put on as of this program. So we're very proud and excited, but we're waiting to celebrate until we get confirmation, which hopefully I will have next week. In the meanwhile, it feels good to maybe have won one and have an entire year to lobby for the Nordic model. And that's it for this week. You've been listening to us on CBS Radio WJFK 1580 AM, or you've been visiting us at WMCLive.com for this and for a whole rich archive of every one of our previous episodes. Be sure to find WMC Live on Facebook, Twitter, and at iTunes worldwide, where you can stream, download, and subscribe to our show's podcast. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. WMC President and Executive Producer of this program, Julie Burton. Senior Producer, Crystal Williams Chancellor. And our founding sponsor, Regina K. Scully. I'm Robin Morgan. Thank you for being with us. Look for us on Facebook and Twitter for alerts about exclusive breaking news segments, surprise upcoming guests, and future shows. And join us next week when we'll look at literature and language through the perceptive eyes of such writers as Judy Blume, Poet Laureate Rita Dove, and the wonderful Ursula K. Le Guin. Only here on Women's Media Center Live.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, tune your radio to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio and WMCLive.com. Talk radio with a brain.